there are many Gen Zers out there that this is exactly what they want. They want a faith that actually impacts their day-to-day life. I think we have a generation that's seeking authenticity, that's wanting to experience life change. There are young leaders that are hungry, or young people, I think they're all leaders, that are hungry for a life-changing faith.
These are all Gen Zs, man.
Yeah.
I mean, their hearts are on fire, and they want that. They want what they see. They just haven't seen enough of it. And then we get them into there. I don't think the isolation is what they really want. I think the community is what they really want. So let's help them find that. Hello, Jim Shepard here with my friend Frank Beeler for the Next Sunday podcast. Frank, we are now on episode 4. We made it.
Episode 4.
Against all odds.
Against all odds and opposition. Oh, wow. It's been so overwhelming.
You know, there were some people out there who were betting the over and under, and I'm just guessing 4 was maybe the number.
4 was
will
the
Jim and Frank make it to 4 before they implode?
Yeah, that's it.
We've gotten this far.
We've made it.
We've made it so far.
It feels like an accomplishment of some kind.
Well, I love the first 3 episodes that we've done, too. So we've covered a lot of ground, and we're going to cover a lot of ground today, too.
Yeah.
But I love the ground that we've covered the last 3 episodes. I feel like we've offered some good content out there for people to listen to.
For sure. I'm excited about this one because I think it builds on some of the things that were discussed in that very first episode around Gen Z and how we can be just leading well and engaging a younger group of leaders into the church.
Well, and you know how much I love to talk about that topic, so this won't be hard at all today. We might have to edit it down a little bit.
Yeah, shrink it down.
Finished,
yeah, you've got a lot of thoughts on it.
Well, you've got lots of ways to talk about it, too, and you know what I like to talk about, which is what's making this podcast work so well, is we've spent enough time together that you know what I like to talk about. I know how you like to respond, and so hopefully for all of you who are watching the podcast, that's kind of what's coming across. We have these conversations. And we've got a nice studio in here, but this is kind of like just dropping a microphone into the conversations that you and I have all the time, which is our goal.
That's right. And I know I've said it before, but I think it's unfair that I have the privilege of getting to spend time with you, Jim, and getting to pick your brain and get your insight and wisdom. And so now for there to be this forum for us to be able to share some of those things with others in that same conversation that we get to have is such a blessing.
Yeah.
So
well, and it's not, I don't want anybody to think that there's some super smart thing going on here, but it's just the accumulation of all these observations I've had for all these years, kind of watching the kingdom, watching young leaders, watching generosity, obviously, and just all the things that happen in the context of a church. And we get to peel that out and kind of talk about it in front of an audience now. So I'm having a blast doing it.
Yeah, it's one of the things, Jim, that's really intriguing to me is when I first started getting to know you and then work with you and just kind of explore how to best serve churches. When you go in, more often than not, someone's reached out to you through Generis to say, hey, help us with a capital campaign or help us with our giving strategy of our church because we're seeing a lack of engagement in some way, or they want to improve engagement with the mission and vision of the church. And when you're doing that, I think what I thought was happening from the outside looking in was that you're taking data points on giving, doing assessments, and putting a strategy to solve a giving problem. And what I'm realizing is that it's just a great indicator of what's going on in the life and health of the church. But what value you bring and the other leaders at Generis bring is they're now bringing these insights that are helping with engaging younger generations or this demographic or trying to figure out a problem that may reveal something with volunteering or attendance or all kinds of other issues kind of percolate. And so generosity becomes a great indicator of what's going on in the life and health of a church.
Yeah. And so a lot of that comes from my background before I came to this work. I was a financial guy in the public marketplace. I was certified public accountant at one point in time. By the way, you know what, at this point in my life, you know what CPA really stands for, right?
What's that?
Couldn't pass again.
Couldn't
pass again.
Fair enough.
But I was a CPA, right? And I was a CFO of a large publicly held company. And so for me, I was never the smartest guy. Now, I wasn't dumb because I passed the exam, but I wasn't the smartest guy when it came to debits and credits. Here's what I knew. Numbers and data tell a story. And what the CEOs loved about me and how I got promoted was I knew how to find the story in the data, and I would stare at it long enough. And it frustrated all the guys who were smarter than I was because they were going in with all the data and everything. I was like, I don't think the CEO wants to see that. He can see that for himself. He wants what's going on behind that. Well, the same thing has happened in the last 30 plus years, 31 plus years, as I've been watching churches. Data is informative because it helps us to see what's happening, but we don't just use data to make stuff happen. It's a barometer for us, and it lets us know what story is going on behind the scenes. And as you know, and I know, there's a lot of sub stories happening that a lot of leaders are just not seeing because they're not paying attention to the data. So
That's great, Jim. I love that.
we may
So
do a whole podcast on that one day. That would be a great one.
I
Just to
would
talk
love that
through it.
podcast.
Yeah,
I
that would
could
be a,
geek out
that'd be
over
a fun
that.
one.
Yeah, I could get really
But that's
into
not
that.
what we're here to talk
Yeah,
about today.
No. Today, what we're talking about is one of the stories or narratives that we're seeing in the local church is this struggle to effectively engage Gen Z. And so before I've got some questions written down, Jim, that I think will be productive in our conversation today. But before we get there, like how do you set this conversation today up for the leaders that are currently running the church, overseeing the church? They're listening to this podcast today. How do you set the tone for the conversation when it comes to engaging and serving these younger generations? What is it that we're missing, or what perspective do we need before we dive into kind of some of the nuanced details of all this?
So, you want me to take the rest of the podcast and talk about this, or is this just part of it?
Give me
Give me a high
30,000
level
feet.
view.
Okay.
All right. So, here's where my frustration is, mainly with my peers. I'm in my 60s. If y'all haven't figured out, I'm a boomer. I am definitely a boomer. I'm not masquerading as something other than that. I'm a boomer. But what frustrates me, Frank, is the number of people in my generation who are looking at people who are 23, 24, 25, that's our Gen Zs, 27 years old, and they're judging them based on who they are as a 25-year-old, right? And comparing that to who you are as a 62-year-old or a 64-year-old. You can't do that. You can't do that, right? I mean, you're closer to 25 than I am. Would you want to be held accountable for the things you said and did at age 25? I
Absolutely
wouldn't.
not.
I wouldn't.
Yeah.
And what I'm grateful for is that I had mentors who were patient with me, So rather than looking at them and calling them by these labels, by the way, we mentioned this in the last episode. I mean, come on, guys. I mean, if you're a boomer, we had people, all the people that you're describing, Gen Z and millennials, we had all of those. We had entitled people, we had lazy people, we had malcontents. I mean, all of those were alive in our generation. We just didn't have labels that we put on them, and we didn't have social media, so it wasn't as immediately obvious in their behavior on a day-to-day basis as we watched it play out in social media, right? But you wouldn't want to be judged for that, because you need people to be patient with you and help you. That's the whole purpose of mentoring, is to come alongside these guys and help them be a better version of a 25-year-old than I was. That's my goal, man. I mean, if I can just help you be a better 25-year-old than I was. Now, of course, I didn't become a Christ follower until I was 28. So being a better 25-year-old than I was is a pretty low bar. We don't need to go there today. We can tackle that some other day. But it's an age-old problem, right?
Yeah.
It's not new. Okay. How do I know it's not new? So in Acts 15, verse 36, we see the dialogue. Luke is a writer of Acts. So Luke is telling us about this disagreement between Paul and Barnabas, who were great friends.
Yeah.
I mean, they did so much good together, but they had this disagreement, and the disagreement was over one person, this young guy named John Mark. Now, he went on to write the Gospel of Mark, right? So, I mean, he did pretty well for himself.
Yeah.
But they had this disagreement, and Paul was holding him accountable for this one thing that he did in Pamphylia, where he was supposed to show up and he didn't. And Paul couldn't get that out of his memory, and Barnabas wanted to take him with him. And so what they did was, now, by the way, God used this for good, because the gospel spreads more as a result of Paul and Barnabas separating. But I want to just focus on, what if Paul had been more patient with John Mark in the moment? Barnabas was patient with him, to say, hey, maybe he is worthy of some development. If somebody will invest in him right now, maybe something good could come out of his life. And that did happen. And Barnabas showed that kind of patience. And that's what I'm saying to my friends who are boomers. What if we had the mindset of Barnabas and not the mindset of Paul when it came to John Mark? Do you think some things could change? I do. I think some things could be very different.
ultimately we have to believe that the leaders that God's entrusted to our care, those young leaders that are going to make dumb mistakes, that are coming across our path, that they have potential and they're called into ministry to do something for the kingdom, and they need some guidance and some support to help make that happen. I wonder, I'm going off script right out the gate here.
All good.
Okay. I wonder if the church's more recent pursuit of excellence, so larger churches, mega churches, that pursuit of excellence and quality has eliminated some of the room for younger leaders. And let me say it this way. So in a small church, when the youth pastor, the part-time bivocational youth pastor gets up on stage to preach on Sunday, it might be a little heretical, but there's the benefit of the doubt. And it's like, you got to learn some way. Same in youth group, where I was watching American Idol last night on TV. Came on after one of the sports games I was watching. And I'm hearing all this young talent, and several of them mentioned that they started singing in church. And yet, uniquely, in many youth groups today, there's not room for those young leaders to develop their voice because they're not good enough yet. They're not good enough to even perform for a youth group worship band. It's almost like, in the name of us putting out quality and a great experience, we've eliminated some of the room for mistakes, for room for growth and improvement along the way, unless you're just epically gifted at something. So how do you see that showing up? So there's on the one hand, there's this lack of tolerance for the boneheaded mistakes, right? Along the way, that there's some good in here. I got to mentor them through it, help them avoid some of this stuff. So there's that. But then there's also maybe I'm wrong. I'm okay to be wrong here. Maybe there's a little less room to not be perfect or excellent in your whatever you're trying to do in the church.
Frank, I think you've really hit the issue. I think that's a big part of the issue. That those who are in their, say, 50s and 60s, who are in leadership in the church, are so hyper-focused on being so absolutely excellent with no room for mistakes that it had. And by the way, I love excellence as a value,
of course.
But the unintended consequence of being hyper-focused is that you don't allow any room for those who might not be as experienced as you are. Mm-hmm. Now, that said, I think there are always some environments where we can give people like their first place, your first, run at it. Mm-hmm. If you're multi-site, campus pastors have a great opportunity for that, right? And doing the announcements, the worship hosting, or whatever that might be, whatever that looks like in your church. In my church, we always have a host pastor and a teaching pastor. They're never the same person. The teaching pastor only teaches. The host pastor does everything else. And so that's a good environment. But let's just think about it. What if even in the offering moment, that's another conversation altogether, but the offering moment, that 2-minute giving time that we talk about every week, what if you just give them that? And help them be really good at that and rehearse it. And they've got to rehearse with you before they stand up on Sunday. But if they can be really, really good, Jesus said, those who are faithful in the smaller things, you can give them responsibility for the bigger things. So let's give them something smaller and let them show faithfulness in that, and then move them up. But you've got to be willing to accept the fact that they might not do it the way you did, and then help them get better. That's the patience I'm talking about. The patience that Barnabas was showing to John Mark. Hey, Paul, maybe he's young, man. He didn't know any better, right? I'm just imagining the conversation. And Paul, yeah. Tell it to the hand. Remember, Paul was a Jew of Jews, so he was all about, you got to play by the rules here, buddy. Yeah. That's what you got to do. But Barnabas was giving him a little bit more of a shake on hey, he goofed up one time, but what if he could be really good? And that's really, I think, the idea for us here. Excellence has its place as a value, but not being so hyper-focused that it gets in the way of developing younger talent who might not be as polished as you are.
But how does the church actually create an avenue to do that? Like, do we leverage technology? Is it a one-on-one setup? Do they do some kind of small group? How do you facilitate Okay. So there's obvious the young leader that God's put in your life that you're supposed to mentor and be patient with. There's those. Then what about the young leaders that are in the church? Maybe they're successful business leaders, young people looking to find their place in the church, not called necessarily to full-time ministry, but they want to have an impact. They want to get involved. They want to figure out how to shape what they're currently doing through their faith, both showing up during the work week, but then also on Sunday and the way they serve. How does the church facilitate? Have you seen any best practices or ways that's been effective of engaging not just a handful of young leaders we hired to be on staff or that are in our internship program, but what about other leaders in the church?
I don't know that anybody's really figured that out well yet. There's some good ones out there. There's some hopeful signs. I think, my friend Jonathan Pokluda, JP, at Harris Creek Church in Waco, he's becoming a magnet for young leaders just in the way that he's in his mid-40s. That he just provides that opportunity for them. And I would say, I think for us too, Frank, is to remember that there's really kind of two levels of mentorship. There's some people that you're going to mentor one-on-one, and then you can do it in cohorts. But the same two principles apply regardless of which one that is, right? And it's the idea that you have to put yourself in proximity to these people and you have to make yourself available. So proximity and availability, right? And once you do that, I mean, I'm aware of how big the mentor crisis is because when I put myself in proximity and make myself available, I get flooded with people, right? And so I was like, whoa, wait a second, that's more than I can take on. And so it just reinforces to me the lack of people who are out there really to do it. So what I'd love to see is more of it happening at the local church level, where an older pastor, older being 55, 60 or whatever, not old, but older than those generations, begins to make themselves available. For the ones who have high potential, one-on-one. I mean, that's you've watched that with me.
Yeah.
I've got about 6 that are in real close proximity to me that I'm mentoring on a one-to-one basis on a regular interval. But there's a whole bigger group that I'm speaking into more periodically, right? As a group in pods and cohorts. I'd create cohorts. Some of them might be gender-based because I think the way that you would mentor young women in the church might be different than the way that you would mentor young men. And nothing theological being stated here. I'm just saying that I think it would be different. But I also think there could be some cohorts where they are mixed gender, but they're all based on age and stage. So you're going to grab the Gen Zs, get them together. You're going to grab them. And by the way, let me tell you what I'm starting to see. I'm starting to see some of the ones who are at the older end of the millennial spectrum begin speaking into the Gen Zs. And that's fun to watch.
Yeah.
Because they have a lot to offer. They were just there recently. And a lot of them could say, hey, if I could take and back up the clock 12 years and do it differently, let me tell you some things I would do. I mean, that's great stuff to say. So I think leveraging technology could help because you can create Zoom calls and Zoom environments and, or Teams, whatever you're using. But I think you've also got to have that community, that close in personal touch if you're going to do that.
I think a lot of churches, I love that, Jim. I think a lot of churches, they're looking for this comprehensive solution where we just got to start somewhere. So there's that old line it's been attributed to multiple church leaders, but do for a few what you wish you could do for many. Yeah. Right. So it'd be great to help every young leader in the church and help them all place wherever they're going to go. But let's start with those that are raising their hand, wanting more leadership, wanting to figure out their place in the church or whatever. Say, how do we match make them, connect them with leaders, and whether it be in a cohort or whatever it may be, let's start with that group. One thing practically that I believe that we can do as the church, and this comes from senior leadership down, is looking at leaders in the church and saying, we want you to set aside a certain amount of time every single week for mentoring, to serve people that can do nothing for you. You're only serving them. I heard a line, Andy Stanley once said, it wasn't a point on his screen. He just casually said this line, it's not my job to fill your cup, but it is my job to empty mine. And so on my calendar, there are 2.5 hours a week. There's a reason it's 2.5 hours, but 2.5 hours a week called EYC, empty your cup. So EYC : and then somebody's name. And that's they can't do anything for me. They're not paying me. This isn't some formal relationship. These are people that genuinely, I just want to serve and help. And I can't help but wonder if the church started from a place of going, what if we got 2 hours a week from a bunch of leaders, bunch of old people in the church, old people,
OGs, some OGs.
Yeah, that's it. Some OGs to say, would you give 2 hours a week? And it's not going to be structured and every Tuesday at a certain time or whatever. Maybe it does fall in a cohort or whatever, but let's start by saying, how do we make ourselves available? What I see is that there are older leaders saying, hey, I'd be happy to mentor somebody if somebody came to me and asked. And you got young leaders asking. It's like, well, the church can do some matchmaking, but we first of all have to see who's interested and who's willing. And so I think setting aside some time, saying, I'm willing to commit this amount of time per week to do Zoom calls or phone calls or whatever it may be, or hang out with somebody over coffee, whether it be in a group setting or individual. I think it can start to facilitate some of that mentoring that we're talking about. What do you think about that?
So I love that idea, Frank. Both in the staff and in the volunteer environment. So I think you got to do both. So as it relates to the staff, I think the pastor's got to set the pace. If the pastor is not doing some mentoring, it's going to be hard to get anybody else to do
Agreed.
it. And then you extend that from the pastor to whoever the executive staff is, and you make it a part of their job. Maybe even put it into their KPIs, right? And then you begin to recruit this cadre of lay people who want to do the same thing. But you have to start with the leadership. I mean, for example, Harris Creek is known for being, a place where young leaders can get developed because of JP. I mean, he does it. Mm-hmm. And if JP didn't do it, it wouldn't have traction in other places. Hey, JP, sorry, bro, I know I'm putting you on the spot, but you do such a good job of that. And I want people to know that.
So right. we'll put his personal email address in the show notes.
Exactly.
And people can just email him and ask for his
give his cell phone number out.
Too. Oh, yeah, we'll do
that.
Yeah,
why not? That would work. But I think that's the key. And I think you make a good point. It's just making yourself available and then creating the incentive, really this motivation, this EYC time. I love that idea. 30 minutes at a time, maybe 5 times a week. Who are you emptying your cup with?
Yeah. Everything indicates to me that there are many Gen Zers out there that this is exactly what they want. They want a faith that actually impacts their day-to-day life. Right. They're not wanting to go through the motions, just like you pointed out. You could memorize the scriptures, but you went a long time without being a believer, but you were checking all the boxes at church. I think we have a generation that's seeking authenticity, that's wanting to experience life change. We're seeing this with the revival moments that are happening all across the country on college campuses, and the incredible movements by Jenny and other leaders that are just like, wow, there are young leaders that are hungry, or young people. I think they're all leaders that are hungry for a life-changing faith that doesn't just show up on Sunday, and yet I think the church doesn't know what to always do with them, or there's only so much capacity for them. So therefore, we keep talking about wanting something to change or be different without really changing our behaviors or models to embrace or support what's happening.
Frank, one of the mistakes we make unwittingly is we sit in rooms and there's nobody under the age of 50 sitting at the table, planning programs, planning worship services, planning activities, and then we wonder why the younger generation doesn't like what we do. Mm-hmm. Well, you've missed it because you don't have their voice in the room helping you to see what you're even missing. So you sit there in the room and you're wondering what you're missing, but you don't even know because you don't have somebody like that in your room. So, I'm not saying put them on executive team just so you'll have a younger person, but create forums where you can listen to them, where you can have younger generation play a worship service in front of them. Just cue it up and play it.
Yeah.
And get a bunch of 25-year-olds in a room and say, hey, what did you love about this? And what did you not love about this? How could we do this better? What would we take out? What would we do differently? Because until you do that, you're never going to see where the gaps are and how you're missing connecting generations, right?
Jim, I love that. And the great example of this. Are you ready for this?
I'm ready.
The Savannah Bananas.
The Savannah Bananas.
The baseball team.
Oh, my God.
Okay, so they're hot right now.
Hot.
But let me tell you why this is awesome. Savannah Bananas, even with all their fun stuff, when they're blowing up on social media, which now they're massive, over 1 million followers,
Yeah.
and I mean, they're blowing up. But when they were already messing with programming, do you know what happened? People were still leaving in the 7th inning stretch. They were still leaving before the game was over. And they went through, pulled back, and said, at what moments is the crowd disengaging? What moments are they leaving? What moments are they getting up and going to get food that seems like an odd time for them to go? And they kept evaluating, going, what do we need to tweak or change? What are they not engaging with? How can we create new moments in those pockets along the way? Now, a lot of trial and error there to figure it out, but they were passionate enough to go, how do we keep them engaged the whole time? And I love that posture. The other thing I would say is this. If you're wanting to serve a younger generation, you're wanting to figure out some things for programming, you've got to quit focusing on the ROI, the return on investment. Because here's what we'll do. We'll go, well, that young programming thing, they only had 12 people there, and there was all this time and energy and discussion in it. And we had at our last women's event, 200 ladies. I was like, well, you've been doing adult ministry for a really long time. Congratulations. You've invested tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars to figure out what's going to resonate and connect. And so if we can let go of the ROI for a season and go, okay, let's start something and let's be willing to let it grow and change iteration and not be frustrated by that, but go, this generation is worth investing in. And it doesn't mean that it has to be big or epic or nothing. There's somewhere in the middle to go, who has God entrusted to our care? I use that language a lot. Who has God entrusted to our care in our church? You've got a group of young people that are attending either regularly or sporadically for whatever reason. What can we do to best serve them? Not some agenda so it becomes the next new big thing and it's going to be epic, but you might put the same time, energy, and effort that you do in building something small initially for that generation that you do for your next massive church-wide event when it comes to dollars, time, energy, effort, programming. And yet, if we want to do it, we've got to experiment. We've got to be willing to explore. And when we do that, we've got to be okay going, okay, well, I was hoping there'd be a little bit more. I wonder what we could do different next time. And let us have time to actually build something to serve this next generation. So if we launch a mentorship program and it starts with 5, that's more than 0. So that's a massive increase from 0. Okay. Now, do we want to get it to 10? Yeah, it might be another year or whatever it may be till we get there. We're doing a good work. It's not a failure. And so I think we get so hung up on the ROI for serving a new generation that unless it's something massive in scale, we think it's not worth our time, energy, and effort compared to things we've been doing forever.
Right. You can't get this late in a podcast episode and introduce a topic like this.
Hey-o.
You can't do this. I have so much to say about what you just said, but let me just start with a couple of things.
Let's do it.
Not just the ROI that you talk about, but the one that I hear.
Yeah.
Here's the one I hear. Oh, well, Jim, those young adults, how they give. So they're measuring the ROI compared to what they think the giving is happening in that group, which is really disheartening. Really disheartening.
And not very biblical.
Not very biblical. And also extremely myopic, which we're really good at in the church, which brings me to this way that I think I can summarize this. I had an early mentor who said this, and he was really talking about financial investing, but I've learned that he was really talking about life. And he said it this way: the longer your time horizon for your decision, the wiser it will be. I'll say that again. The longer the time horizon for your decision, the wiser it will be. This is a long play. I would say not only don't measure ROI, don't expect ROI for a while. It's a long play. You're putting seed into the ground and you're going to have to water it and fertilize it. And oh, by the way, pull a few weeds along the way, because these are young people, just like you were at one day. And somebody had to come and pull weeds in your life. And so if we could think 10, 12, 15 years down the road and decide to invest now, we'll be much, much wiser in our decision making. I'm going to cut it off there because this is, I could say so much on that topic. And it really is about short-term decision making. It's about investing without expecting ROI. It's all of those things. And you touched on it when you brought the topic up.
Well, let's make sure that becomes another episode or
Somewhere
two or
down the
three,
road.
somewhere down the road.
I got an idea. Why don't we do about that next Sunday?
Next Sunday.
See where I went there?
Ayo.
That was way too easy.
That was way too easy.
Way too easy.
Well, Jim, thanks again for another great conversation. I think we had the opportunity to help people today, process some stuff out loud. We hope this served you well. If you're watching online via YouTube or whatever channel, or you're listening, hey, we would love for you to like or subscribe as always. As you know, that helps get it out to other people so other people can find out about it and hopefully enjoy this content as well. If you found something specifically helpful today, be sure to message us. Let us know through our social media channels, or you can find us easily, whether it be through Generis or Jim's account or my account or whatever. It doesn't matter. But if you found something helpful or something you want us to unpack further, feel free to throw that in a direct message to us. We'd love to read that and explore that further. Until next Sunday.
And we will see you when?
Hey, next Sunday.
Next Sunday.